Ramarie. I'm Bruce Munro, and with me is International Relations Specialist Professor Robert Patman, and this is Global Insight. In recent days, the United States has urged its citizens to leave Ukraine. US officials believe that Russia is about to expand its attacks on the country it invaded 6 months ago. Welcome, Robert.
Morning, Bruce.
Why would Russia be planning to go beyond military targets and start hitting civilian and government infrastructure in Ukraine?
I'm not sure that is a departure from the past, because Russia, throughout its military campaign, and let's face it, hasn't been wholly successful. What started off as an attempt to seize the whole country has morphed into an attempt to annex the eastern part of Ukraine. And as part of that effort, the Russians have used what could only be described as an artillery-intensive approach, which doesn't make a distinction in reality between civilian and military targets. Just overnight, we heard a train was struck, so something like 15 people were killed. So again, I think civilian targets have been part and parcel, unfortunately, of this very intense conflict.
So what is it that the US officials then are worried about?
I think that they're very conscious of the fact that Ukraine has been getting slightly the upper hand recently. It's become audacious. In the last month, Ukraine has used its newfound artillery capability to launch several decisive strikes on key military targets in Crimea. And remember, Crimea has enormous significance for Mr. Putin because that was the territory which he seized, annexed in 2014 illegally. And now Mr. Zelensky and his forces have had several massive reverses in Crimea, with the fact that Russian holidaymakers in the Crimea have got into their cars and gone. So Mr. Zelensky's using the old Putin trick now of trying to demonstrate to the population of Russia that Mr. Putin can't always protect them. So there's been some indications that Ukraine is beginning slowly, I wouldn't say it's dramatic, but it's certainly audacious, and it's an upping of the tempo from the Ukraine side. So I think the United States has anticipated that on the 6th month anniversary of the war, the 24th of August, and also the 31st anniversary of Ukraine's independence, that Russia may want to regain the momentum somewhat, and they anticipate some sort of incident.
Is it time then for NATO to up its game in this conflict?
That's an interesting question. NATO and its lead nation, the United States, have been very careful while supporting Ukraine. I think virtually all members of NATO support Ukraine. But it's the United States who've been doing the heavy lifting. They've contributed about 10.6 billion in military assistance so far. I think the Brits have contributed about in excess of 2 billion. But the rest have, Germany has pledged quite a lot, but it hasn't always delivered quickly. So the question of NATO, there has been some suggestion that instead of the US being the coordinator or the NUP of this international support effort for Ukraine, then NATO should take on the coordinating role. And that would make quite a lot of sense, because NATO has a strong presence in countries like Poland, which is immediately adjacent to Ukraine. The US has a very strong presence in Poland as well. And Poland, I shouldn't forget, when we talk about countries assisting, they've contributed about $1.8 billion worth of support, so they've been very strong as well. But I think there's a feeling that the longer this conflict goes on, perhaps it would be better, and it would send a good signal from NATO's point of view to Mr. Putin, that it's not just US doing the heavy lifting, and that NATO will coordinate the international assistance. And it might enable NATO to put more pressure on its members, which are in principle supporting Ukraine but not doing enough in practice.
A good signal to Putin, you said, but would it be inflammatory to Putin?
Let's be quite clear. Most things are inflammatory to Mr. Putin. He said that NATO's presence in Eastern Europe was inflammatory, and he demanded it would go back to the 1997 lines. But what he's saying is that the countries of Eastern Europe have exercised their sovereignty and joined the military organisation called NATO. If that's a provocation, if he's provoked by the sovereign acts of other countries, that's very difficult to deal with. I think Mr. Putin has to deal with the consequence. He's invaded a country. He's attempted to annex it in the most brutal fashion. His troops have probably carried out war crimes there. I don't think we should be tiptoeing around someone who's committed aggression on this scale. He has to live with the consequence. No one made him invade Ukraine, so he has to deal with the consequences with it. And I think the very least, we shouldn't be worrying about Mr. Putin. We should be more concerned, in my judgment, about making sure that the Ukrainians, the victim of this unprovoked aggression, have their territorial integrity restored, and we should do what's necessary to achieve that.
Today we've heard that a New Zealand soldier, Dominic Aberlin, has been killed in Ukraine. It's understood that he was fighting in eastern Ukraine. In what ways is the Russian invasion of Ukraine reshaping the world?
I think the Russian invasion of the Ukraine is a defining moment in the post-Cold War era. And the definition that emerges will depend on the outcome of the conflict. As we've discussed before, New Zealand has a big stake in the outcome. We can't really be indifferent to a conflict in which, if Mr. Putin prevails, the international rules-based system, which New Zealand heavily depends, could be compromised. And it's not just New Zealand, it's most small and middle powers that have long-range international connections or widespread international connections. On the other hand, if Mr. Putin is defeated during this conflict, it will send, I think, a message of caution to China, which in my view has rather rashly backed Mr. Putin's adventurism in the Ukraine. And I do think Xi Jinping, the Chinese leader, will pay a big domestic political price if Mr. Putin's efforts to annex eastern Ukraine fail, if Russian troops are defeated. And when we talk about this, Bruce, there's a lot of media commentary which suggests that Ukraine can't win and it has to settle for some sort of territorial deal with this great power. Well, first of all, the Russian army has performed, it's underperformed. And secondly, there must be doubts about a country which can't properly feed its own troops about being a great power. But thirdly, and most importantly, we know that great powers can and do lose wars like this. The United States lost in Vietnam when it was the #1 power by a huge margin. The Soviet Union, Russia's predecessor, lost in Afghanistan, and the United States lost in Iraq. So Ukraine is a country of more than 40 million. It's a lot bigger and stronger than many of the countries we've just identified as having defeated a superpower. So, Ukraine is determined, and it's got lots of advantages on its side. It's fighting for its own territory. The Russians have got somewhere to depart to, and there are signs of real demoralization within the Russian army. The morale within the Ukrainian army remains very high. Of course, the Russians have the absolute edge in terms of the artillery advantage, but that's going to be eroded over time, not least because the Russians are now having problems replacing the artillery they've got. And in addition, the Russian economy is coming under strain. So, I still think it's a much more fluid situation than many people appreciate. But I do think, coming back to your question, the outcome of this conflict will have wide reverberations, and we've already seen in terms of the distribution of food and also energy has been disrupted by this conflict. So, it's a key moment in the emergence of the 21st century, and it's important, I think, that powers seeking to use might to extend their ambitions are thwarted in this situation.
Thank you, Robert.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching. Catch us next time on Global Insight. Te pono me te araha.